All right. Sorry about the delay there. It just took a couple extra minutes to turn over the room. Super excited to be introducing this panel and the moderator for this panel, and then I'll hand it off to him. AMAR is a dear friend. I've known him for 20 years. AMAR is head of product at Livongo Health. AMAR has moved up and down the healthcare stack, developing pharma and medical products, connected health devices and wearables, and now software-defined services for chronic disease management. AMAR was class of 2000 at MIT. And I would be remiss not to mention that Livongo is hiring data scientists and data engineers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Vivek, and thank you all for joining us today. We have an extraordinary panel of MIT alums here ready to talk about AI that's coming straight from the labs. We're going to have a focus on healthcare in the conversation we'll have today. And I'll start by introducing Ed. Ed BOYDEN is a professor of biological engineering and brain and cognitive sciences at the MIT Media Lab, where he leads the synthetic neurobiology group. He also co-directs the MIT Center for Neurobiological Engineering, and he received his PhD from Stanford in addition to his degrees from MIT. Next up, we've got SURYA GANGULI. SURYA is an assistant professor at the Department of Applied Physics at Stanford, and his lab works at the intersection of physics, neuroscience, and machine learning to understand how neural circuits work. Before that, SURYA was at MIT for a long time, where he earned his triple major in math, physics, and EECS, and he spent time as a graduate student at Berkeley, where he completed his PhD in string theory. Welcome, SURYA. Next up, we've got Vijay Pandey, a general partner at Andreesen Horowitz, where he's leading the firm's investments that are at the cross-section of biology and computer science. Before that, he was a professor of chemistry, structural biology, and computer science at Stanford. Sounds like you still are, Vijay. And received his degree in physics from Princeton, and then his PhD at MIT. And then finally, we have Eduardo Hara, who's the CEO of Robot Rebuilt, which is about sensitive manipulation. Sounds kind of creepy, but is going to be used for good. We'll hear about this, which is based on technology that he developed during his PhD at MIT. He's since then gone on to spend time as an assistant professor at WPI and then at SRI here in Silicon Valley before starting his company. He has degrees, his master's and PhD in electrical engineering and computer science from MIT. So it's going to be a fun conversation. What I'd like to ask of the audience is that you start submitting your questions now through the app for the MIT CNC. And so download the app. It'll only take a minute. You should have received your credentials. And those questions will show up on the board towards the end of the conversation with folks. So start getting those in now for us, please. So, you know, this is it's funny how Hemant said, you know, we've sort of been here before. And there's a tremendous amount of hype and enthusiasm around AI. So we could start by asking the question of where is the promise and where should we be looking. But I think it's kind of more fun and maybe a little bit more irreverent to start with the opposite, which is where has the hype outpaced the hope? Where have we maybe already gotten ahead of ourselves? And for folks here on the panel who've been doing this for decades, I think we'll get a really great insight. So Ed, would you mind kicking us off?
Sure. Yeah, so one angle on this is that my group works on the intersection of technology and biology. How can we understand what's going on in a brain disorder or in a cancer or in an autoimmune disease and so forth? And we think that we need to build new tools to help us understand that. And so one thing that's really become clear to us is that biology occurs over so many different length scales. You have individual molecules all the way to entire organ systems and the entire body. And so one thing that we're starting to work on, and we have a paper coming out soon actually on one of these results, is how do we get more information from a biological system so that you can do better machine learning and better understanding of disease. And big data is not enough. It has to be the right kind of data. If you have data that's at too low resolution, or you're losing out on specific kinds of critical temporal or spatial scales, then it can be very misleading sometimes to make conclusions from it. So just as an example, we've been working on technology where we can take cancer biopsies, infuse them with a chemical, it's a lot like the stuff in baby diapers, and then physically blow them up to be 100-fold bigger in volume. And we have a paper coming out soon where we show that, working with Andy Beck at Harvard, that you can classify these cancers much more accurately. And these are cancers that experts will disagree on the diagnosis, leading to lots of unnecessary procedures. So one of our hopes is to build tools that can get the right kind of data, and not just big data. I mean, you need a lot of data, but it needs to be the right kind.
Yeah, this is an interesting topic. I think it will come back to it, which is this sort of question of garbage in, garbage out, and are we looking at the right things? Are we looking at the right level of resolution in order to draw out insight? That's going to be a topic we'll cover again. Vijay, in talking with you earlier, one of the comments you made was the timescales here are really a big question, and there's a big difference between replacing doctors, which will take a long time, versus augmenting doctors. And so, not to dish on one of the high flyers in the space, but Watson is a good example of a company that's sort of leading in some ways, but also is, I think, encountering some of the reality. So would you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, I mean, especially in talking about what the hype is. There's been many AI winters that we talk about. Like, 40 years ago, we thought AI had solved everything, and then 30 years ago, then 20 years ago. But, there has been progress. I mean, there's been these moments, like the moments where Deep Blue can beat a chess master. And how's that possible? How can you beat someone at chess, but you can't, do other things? Well, it's because chess has very well-defined rules. And I think a lot of times we forget that we are not good at just applying rules, but we're good at figuring out rules. We're good at figuring out what are the salient elements. That's so much of what we think of as intelligence. And I think what is different now is the fact that, in a technical sense, machine learning is getting better at coming up with its own features. And so in certain areas like images or things that look like pixels, like genomics, actually, it's more digital, more pixel-like. Deep learning methods can come up with features and do some exciting things. The challenge will be for something that doesn't look like that. How can you get the featurization? And so I think there'll be many areas where computers will do better, and we'll see industries just change dramatically. But then some things will be easy, some things will be hard. And actually, I think it'll be very counterintuitive what will be easy and what will be hard. I think a lot of people have thought chess would be hard and predicting images of cats would be easy. But it's actually the other way around.
Surya, one of the points you made on this topic was that one of the constraints that we're all experiencing is data silos. And I think that relates to this topic. Another point you mentioned was that there are talent silos. So maybe you could talk a bit about that and how those impact.
Yeah, I think part of the hype around machine learning is that it is a panacea for all things, that you can solve any problem by just throwing machine learning at it. But if you actually look at the way that the sausage is made in industry or in even academia, what's happening is you throw tons of grad students or tons of workers and you tune these networks to work, or you try all sorts of different things, and there's lots of person hours going into getting a successful machine learning system to work in the wild. And so you build up these, and of course you have to have really good data to get it to work. So it's almost as if people are saying AI is electricity. Well, actually, data is gold, right? I mean, if you don't have that, you can't really do anything at all. And also another aspect of the hype is, I like your play of words on hype and hope, but there's a kind of a third H word, which is hysteria, and hype kind of builds into hysteria. Part of the hype is that these machine learning systems really understand what they're doing to the point where they're attaining some kind of human level intelligence. And that's not at all what's going on. They're in some sense glorified pattern recognition devices that can get really fooled. There's this famous thing called adversarial examples where you can take these image classifiers and add tiny amounts of noise that are imperceptible to us, say to a picture of an elephant, and with high confidence, something that looks like to us like an elephant will look like an ostrich with high confidence in the network, which suggests that these machines are fundamentally not understanding the tasks they're asked to do, which means they're so far away from taking over the world.
It's more like training a dog, right? I mean, sort of, yeah. And I think that's the thing that people, if there is a neural connection, it's more lower brain than upper brain. I mean, and I think that's the part that people don't realize is that, and the funny thing is we don't program them, we train them. And it's a very different type of paradigm But like a dog, you can easily throw the ball and have it behind your back, and your dog will go looking for the ball. It's easy to get overfit.
I want to come back to the dog training too. That's another really great topic to dig into. Okay, we've been through this before. This is the third or fourth or fifth cycle of hype and hysteria, maybe. Not hysteria yet, I'd say, because we still have a lot of folks starting to place their investment bets, right? So hysteria is going to come soon. But what's different this time? This is, in this fifth cycle, there are some number of factors. We saw comments earlier about a few of them, compute, and data storage. Eduardo, why don't you start us off? What's different this time about, forthcoming of AI, if you want to call it that?
Sure. So let me start by following up the previous question. So, what we're seeing right now is like just one part of AI to be taken over, right? So it's machine learning and data. It's exploiting just because the technology has allowed us to have access to all this data that before we didn't have, or we have it in small amounts, so most of the methods didn't work. So now AI, it's difficult to say at this moment is going to take over, right? And the example I usually use is that I get this question very often because I'm a roboticist and they're like asking me, are the robots going to take over? And so my answer to that is usually, an interesting joke I saw some time ago where they show all these mobile robots got together and saying, we're going to take over the world, and they start running very quickly in a flat terrain until they see the stairs in front of them, and they're like, oops, we can't do it. So they can't, what's different now, going to your second question, is like, yes, we have a lot of data, and that helps us to use a lot of techniques that we had before, and some that, has been developed early on, given the amount of data, that allow us to deal with problems like they are not well structured, for example, images, audio, and in general, things that are coming from a lot of the sensory side. So sensory side is not completely structured, so that's why it has been so difficult. And so those are areas where we can actually get a lot more behavior, more advantages of the data. We have also things like Deep Blue and those kind of approaches. We have a lot more computation. And because we have a lot more computation, we're able to do larger search. And so the search can go on and on. And in the size of data, we also have GPUs, which came from games technology and things like that. But we still are going to miss a lot in the area of behaviors. Even though now in vision system we can recognize a cat from a dog, the system cannot really describe what a cat is, what we people do very easily. And so what's new now is a lot of data. What is being left behind, if we really want to get a lot of intelligence in the real world, like interacting, all that sensory area is being left. And I think I'm going to talk more about later.
Yep, we'll come back to that one too. So let's go back to data silos for a moment, and maybe talent silos too. But one of the comments that MANOLIS made, MANOLIS unfortunately couldn't make it today, he got stuck in transit. But one of the, I think, really important points he made was that we're starting to shift our focus collectively from trying to mimic human intelligence to let's build statistical models to let's solve problems that we understand. And so a topic that we've touched on a bit is in this idea of talent silos and domain knowledge. And I'd love to hear from each of you your take on the relative value of domain knowledge versus, I think one of the factors we're seeing is the explosion in the availability of tools and people to use the tools, which is not the same as people who understand the domains. Sorry, you want to start?
Yeah, I think it's actually kind of ironic. Like, I think domain knowledge is somewhat important, but sometimes we overvalue it because domain knowledge is the product of our own human minds, and oftentimes that knowledge is not exactly up to the task. There's this famous phrase that a Bell Labs manager once said, every time I fire a linguist, my machine translation performance goes up, right? So it's as if linguists thought they really understood language, but at the end of the day, neural networks can sometimes just perform better. And so we have to be very careful, and that's actually something that's exciting about machine learning, is that you can apply it to situations where you do have some partial domain knowledge, but if you just start from raw signals and let the machine learning system figure out its domain knowledge on its own, it often does better than what we might do if we hand-engineered features. That's happened in machine vision, for example. There are these famous features, SIFT and HOG, that people carefully engineered over many, many years. And now end-to-end machine learning systems that ignore that prior domain knowledge work really well. So I think domain knowledge is a double-edged sword. In other situations, it's actually incredibly useful to have it. So we have to think very carefully, and this is why machine learning is an art right now and not a science.
Yeah, especially interesting, like we talked a lot about games, so in AlphaGo, aficionados of Go watching the computer play described it as an alien intelligence. They didn't learn how to play Go the way everyone else did, and that's in part why it was so successful. I mean, one of the things that's also interesting is that we're tempted to make analogies or connections to human intelligence, but in biology versus machines, there's reasons to do things differently. So airplanes fly differently than birds, and as far as I've seen, I've never seen a bird fly Mach 5, and because of the design difference. And so I would think we would not necessarily even want this to work the way we do, but to work even better, perhaps.
So then why do we design machines that are human-like? Why do we seem to insist on that as a paradigm?
Humans cost a lot of money to hire.
Well, it puts us in situations where I think, to your point about the elephant and the ostrich, we end up with, the Microsoft chatbot, right, Tay, who very quickly became an unpleasant person, to put it mildly. And I think it's in part because of this idea that in some ways machines do make the same kinds of mistakes that humans make. So, becoming a racist chatbot on the basis of racist commentary that is sort of, what you intake is pretty much how humans learn. So now that we're talking about, should we be talking about artificial intelligence at all if we're imbuing that with this idea that it's really human intelligence that we're trying to mimic? Or is that in and of itself a construct we should reject because it's taking us off course, to your point about the whole ideas around intuition and whether intuition is the right framework?
Yeah, I think if our goal is to engineer a better society, we need to think about not necessarily having machines mimic humans, but setting up a society in which machines and humans can profitably interact with each other in ways that neither alone could, right? And so there's a lot of societal engineering. Hemant talked about that, and what kind of future do we want to build? We need to bring in science, technology, and society. There's a major on that at MIT. Together in more fruitful ways to really address your question. I don't think we just want to mimic humans.
Yeah, I mean, Steve Jobs has this great quote where he's describing the bicycle versus evolution and talking about how a cheetah can run so much faster than a human being and so much more efficiently, but that a human on a bicycle can do so well, and that he described the computer as the bicycle of the mind. And I think he was onto something there, and what we're seeing now is sort of much more in-depth understanding of what that could mean. That the combination, like a human and a bicycle, is much more than just either of them alone.
Yeah.
I think that combination here is very valuable and is the point.
Let me add one thing here. We're talking about this AI coming from, do we have a brain, and the brain does this. There's a top-down approach usually, and one point to make is don't forget that AI has also this bottom-up approach. So to the point of, yes, we can create an airplane that goes Mach 5 and there's no bird that can do that, but we don't have an airplane that has nearly close dexterity or agility that has a bird. So many times we use the biological systems, but to extract the knowledge that comes from there. And there's a big discussion that's been 80s and 90s about, do we start from the bottom and create intelligence to the top or the top to the bottom? We have met in the middle somewhat nowadays, but it's easy to forget that we do need to learn that from humans too, and animals in general.
Well, there are some drones that could give a hummingbird a good race for it.
Sure, but they can, there's like a lot of discussion around that, right? And this is a discussion that happened 2 decades, right? So we can probably not duplicate it right now.
So Ed, data silos and this idea of bottoms up, one of the things that came up in our earlier conversations was this idea that we need to be looking for the data in the right place, at the right level. And in biology, we have had a historical tendency to apply abstraction because it's convenient and when we need it to wrap our heads around phenomena. But the point you made to me, I'd love for you to talk about is that it's convenient, but it leads us in the wrong direction. So Can you talk about where we should be measuring, what kind of signal to look for in biology in particular, and where abstraction fits in, if at all?
Yeah, well, I think abstraction is essential at some level in order to make sense of complexity, right? If we had to look at the quantum state of every atom in every molecule in every cell, we would be here for I don't know, millions of years probably. But I think part of the problem is it's very convenient sometimes to choose a level of abstraction because of aesthetic purposes or because we feel that we're comfortable thinking at that level, and there are assumptions built in. And so you see this a lot in biology, where people assume that, oh, if we just looked at the genome or just looked at the cell shape or just looked at the behavior or the brain data at this level or whatever, that's enough. And the vast majority of these efforts make some progress, but then hit a brick wall because there's so much going on. I mean, people now are finding out all sorts of interesting interactions between bacteria in the gut and our brains, which control our immune system and so on and so forth. And those are all new discoveries that are just being made right now. So part of the problem, I think, is can we design our informatic infrastructure and our way of thinking about biology so it's a bit more assumption-proof. If a new crazy discovery comes along, so for example, it was just found that there are certain lymph-like immune pathways in the brain. That was only found like last year, right? If there's a way to take new discoveries in stride so that we're not thrown for a loop every few years and have to start over, I think that you could imagine these silos and so forth breaking down, in part because you don't have to make an artificial wall. Oh, I'm just going to focus on this level of abstraction. You're going to focus on that. We'll never be able to connect the dots.
Yeah. That does lead us to kind of the next set of barriers that we will face, as a collective, which is when it comes to both talent and data, we have the aspects of kind of academia and proprietary ownership of data and the constructs that sort of define success. So, Vijay, could you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the interesting things about this space right now, it's moving so quickly and people are being so open about it, that papers are coming on archive very quickly and from companies like Google and Facebook as well as academia. And it feels like every 3 months there's some interesting advance. And then also the code is completely open source for the most part. And so if the code is freely available and advances are there for everybody, what differentiates people? And pretty much is the data. Yeah. I mean, you think about Watson, I don't think Watson has code advances that are beyond whether people have, it does have interesting data.
Right.
And so what we'll see is, I think, the value of data was always high, and pharmaceutical companies understand the value of data, other healthcare companies understand the value of data, but now it's even more so because it's clear what you can do with it. In terms of the personnel part, what I've been finding is that the people that are the most successful ones are the people that can go deep in, for my area, deep in the biology and deep in the computer science. Speaking about abstractions, it's very easy for both sides to abstract, and that if you only understand the genome from a sort of a pure computer science point of view, you're going to miss all the details and nuances. And whether we're talking about the game being venture capital or trying to find the very best startups, where typically the best startup will take everything, like a Google-like situation, and the number 2 or number 3 you'll never even heard of, or even like the best academics, which is not that different. They're the very best people who can go deep in both, and what's different now is that we have young people who have grown up with computers their whole lives and that are getting PhDs in biology. And that's a really unique situation coming into this point where machine learning is so strong.
That's fascinating. You've mentioned this. It's a new breed of founder who can go deep into biology and data science. What then does that imply for where the long poles are going to be? Because we do have this question of what's going to get faster in healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things about healthcare is to ask, even when we talk about healthcare, is healthcare the business of making people healthy or the business of coming up with drugs? The two are not one and the same. And the pharmaceutical industry has done amazing things for the last few decades. Like, if one of us gets a bacterial infection, 100 years ago we'd be dead in a week. Now you can take a pill and you're perfectly fine in a week. It's kind of amazing. But there aren't other examples like that in key areas. Like, if you have Alzheimer's, there's no pill you can take in a week and you're fine. If you're depressed, if you have PTSD, if you have anxiety, type 2 depression. In all these areas, these are inherently behavioral cognitive areas. Yeah. And it's something where the biology is so complicated and so poorly understood that there are going to have to be other approaches. And so where I actually see machine learning computation coming in interesting ways are in going after these areas that traditional biotech actually isn't well suited for, and where a top-down approach with this deeper understanding could have a huge impact into real problems like Alzheimer's.
I've got a couple of kind of fun questions, fanboy questions, I'll be honest. One is, we've sort of had this idea that robots can interact with us in the real world and that we should all have robotic helpers. In healthcare, this theme shows up in caregiver sort of contexts. And so, Eduardo, why don't you talk a bit about how close or far away we are from robots in the home caring for us?
Sure. So nowadays the technology is pretty much there. So the only problem is like, does the economics justify? So the technology is there from the point of view like, do we have some good navigation? Yes, we can interact within some limited environment that we can define. That's great. One part that in general is missing is the manipulation and the contact information, but something that we're making progress on. And what I mean is like, when you have a caregiver at the house, like you have a nurse, the nurse will be easy, like will have no problem going and taking your vitals and using instruments, and while you're not too confident probably in having a robot trying to do that kind of thing, because a robot still looks like a scary, like very stiff thing. But we're making progress in that area too. So it is a kind of technology that's going to come to people. At the beginning, might be teleoperated. That's how people are doing it in home hospitals. Given that now we have quick surgeries, and especially with laparoscopy, you go back to home, and now there's this plan that people at homes they have Wi-Fi technology, so you can have your robot and the doctor in the morning actually connect and interact with the patient and get some vitals and just do the monitoring because you were sent too quickly to home to actually be taking care of the hospital. So that's a technology that definitely is coming and taking advantage of what we have right now.
That's great. We now have a bunch of great questions. I'm going to start working our way through. I'm going to actually pop up here so I can give it a good read. The first one is, chess is a bounded problem. Autonomous driving is more unbounded. What are some of the most unbounded problems you see AI and ML on the cusp of solving?
I can take that one.
Okay.
So in general, perception is still an open problem, right? So just we can detect some objects in vision. Perception like visual perception and language in general, sounds and tact, and tactile feedback is a very open question right now. It hasn't been too much emphasis on this. So those are open problems because we can segment some objects, identify some objects, but in the background we're still capable of dealing with many new things. So those kind of open situations where the environment is unstructured, like the car is one example. Although we have some structure because we have rods, we have lights, we know where the pedestrian is going to come from. So we can take advantage of the things, but as we get into more unstructured environments, that's becoming more and more complex, and that's definitely an open problem still.
Mm-hmm. I've got one here, I think that's a great question for Ed, which is, what standards exist for data acquisition and quality? And that question just disappeared. I'll stop there to answer that one. How about it?
Well, it's interesting because we're at a time now where the kind of data that we can acquire in biomedicine and in biology and health is radically improving all the time. Genomics, of course, has been probably the most famous in terms of the quality and kind of data you can get and the scale, but also physiological mapping, wearable devices. It's incredible the richness of data that can happen. So I almost think it's a two-dimensional question in the sense that you have new kinds of information coming along all the time, and yet you do want to make them in some ways fungible and shareable and collaboration worthy. And I think that's sort of a thing that needs open discussion right now. It kind of riffs off some of the questions we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
But there isn't sort of an overwhelming force that's going to help those two dimensionalities collapse into one cohesive plan.
Mm-hmm. Here's one for SURYA. If machine learning is done via training, how do you debug issues like the elephant-ostrich issue when we don't know exactly why the output was generated?
Yeah, we have a paper on that coming out on Monday in the archive. Yeah, we're actually mimicking ideas from the human brain to prevent this kind of adversarial examples from occurring. But this goes at the heart of the accountability issue, right? how do we get an AI to explain what it's doing when we don't even understand what it's doing? And so one of the things that I think is going to happen in the future is kind of a unification of, applied mathematics, physics, complex systems analysis, biology, and machine learning that yields kind of a science of both biological and artificial circuits that explains why they work, how they work, when they work, right? And this science will have two kinds of implications. One, it will be able to make us do principled design choices on how to design these systems, and it will help us understand, what these systems are doing, right? And, a very simple thing could be like a medical AI that makes disease prognoses, right? It should be able to translate, whatever prognosis it makes, it should be able to explain what were the specific subsets of the training data that led to a high confidence outcome into this particular prognosis. So it doesn't just have the weights of the neural network or whatever machine learning system. It has access to the history of the training data, and it gives you a list of patient cases that were most similar to this case, how they got diagnosed, and why those diagnoses support this one. That's a very simple idea, but there'll be lots more like that, and one of the things we're actively working on is developing a science of machine learning that can help us understand both biological brains and artificial brains.
Yeah, if only we can understand why human beings do things.
That's true. But we can model each other. The very basis of human social interaction is our ability to predict what other people will do without having access to all 10 to the 11th synapses in our brain. So we can make reduced models of each other, and we should be able to do that for artificial systems as well.
Right, but to a limit, right? So that's one of the things that we have to accept with complexity of the system. Like an example I have is like, I don't know if that's true still, NASA used to only fly with a 286 controller because they could determine every state and the possible combinations of the machine. Now as we get, and NASA didn't fly anything above, any instrument above that kind of technology because they didn't have the confidence to say we are in this specific state because it was untractable. So these kind of things are happening right now, and this kind of a trade-off we also have to accept at some point, right? The complexity is going to be so high that we will not be able to predict everything.
Well, I think that is the last question we have time to ask. Thank you all for joining us for this really terrific panel, and thank you to our speakers.